That night, I stood shivering by the stone fireplace while my stepmother struck me, and my father simply looked away. Grandma Evelyn sat nearby, her cream leather gloves perfectly still, until she slowly peeled them off and gripped my hand. I thought it was comfort, but 3 years later, I realized she was silently dismantling their empire. Now, inside a Denver courtroom, I am finally ready to expose the truth about the night the Caldwell dynasty began to burn. My name is Adeline Duke. I am 31 years old, and as I stepped out of the black sedan onto the curb of the Denver District Court, the world seemed to dissolve into a blinding strobe of white light. The air was thin and biting, typical for a Colorado morning in late November, but the heat rising from the press pen was suffocating. I had expected interest. I had expected local news vans. I had not expected a blockade of bodies and microphones that looked less like journalism and more like a feeding frenzy. The name Caldwell was plastered across the chyrons of the monitors set up near the security checkpoint. It was trending on social media. It was on the lips of every reporter shouting over the barricades. "Ms. Duke, is it true you're bankrupt? Adeline, look here. Did you threaten your grandmother? Why are you suing the woman who raised you?" They did not call me Adeline Caldwell. I had dropped that name years ago, shedding it like a layer of infected skin. But today, the connection was the only currency that mattered. I kept my chin parallel to the ground, a posture I had practiced in the mirror of my hotel room for 2 hours that morning. My coat was a sharp, military charcoal, buttoned to the throat, armor. I walked toward the heavy brass doors. The sound of my heels striking the pavement echoed in my ears. Distinct and rhythmic, click, click, click. It sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. Over and over again, it was a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic thumping of my heart, which felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against my ribcage. I was the witness. I was the accuser. And yet, walking into that building, I felt entirely like the prey. Security was a blur of wands and somber nods. The marshals knew who I was. Everyone knew who I was. I was the ungrateful daughter, the prodigal girl returning not to beg for forgiveness, but to burn the castle down. When the double doors to courtroom 4 swung open, the noise of the hallway was instantly severed, replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence. The room smelled of lemon polish and old mahogany, a scent that somehow reminded me of funerals. The gallery was packed. Every bench was filled with spectators, legal analysts, and the curious elite of Denver who had once attended my father's galas. I walked down the center aisle. I did not look at the cameras. I looked straight ahead, toward the bench, until I reached the plaintiff's table. Only then did I allow myself to turn my head to the right. There they were. My father, Richard Caldwell, sat at the defense table. He looked exactly as he did on the billboards advertising his luxury condos in Phoenix. Imposing, tanned, silver-haired, the very picture of American success. He wore a navy suit that I knew cost more than $5,000, tailored to hide the slight softening of his midsection. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking at me. His expression was not angry. It was not hateful. It was disappointed. It was the same look he had given me when I fell off my bike at 7 years old and cried. The same look he gave me when I didn't get straight A's. It was a weaponized disappointment, designed to make me feel small, to make me feel like I had failed him simply by existing inconveniently. He was the king of the mountain, the man who built the Summit Ridge residences, and I was the structural flaw in his foundation. Next to him sat Lydia. My stepmother looked immaculate. She always did. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that suggested softness and vulnerability, a calculated choice against my dark, severe coat. Her blonde hair was swept back in a loose chignon, highlighting her high cheekbones. She was smiling faintly at her lead attorney, a man with a jawline like a granite block, but I knew her better than anyone in that room. I looked down at her hands. They were resting on the table, clutching a small, pearl-studded clutch bag. Her knuckles were white. The tendons stood out under her manicured skin. She was squeezing that bag with enough force to crush a walnut. She was terrified. The realization sent a jolt of cold electricity down my spine. Lydia Caldwell, the woman who could freeze a room with a raised eyebrow, was afraid of me. And then, there was Grandma Evelyn. They had positioned her wheelchair slightly behind the defense table, as if she were a prop to garnish their sympathy. She looked impossibly small, a bundle of expensive wool and silk. Her head was bowed slightly, her silver hair thin and wispy, but she was wearing them. The gloves, a pair of soft, cream-colored leather gloves that covered her hands completely. To the jury, they probably looked like a fashion choice of an eccentric old woman, or perhaps a necessity for poor circulation. To me, they were the most terrifying object in the room. As I took my seat, Grandma Evelyn lifted her head. Her movement was slow, deliberate, like a heavy door creaking open. Her eyes, usually watery with age, locked onto Richard, then slid to Lydia, and finally, they landed on me. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were sharp, lucid, and cutting. It was the look of a hawk perched high on a canyon wall, watching mice scurry in the grass. She gave me the barest nod, a motion so slight that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. "Ms. Duke?" I started, turning to my left. Ava Morales was arranging her files on the table. The federal prosecutor was a striking woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a presence that made you want to straighten your spine. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the stack of documents before her, but her voice was a low, steady hum meant only for me. "Are you ready to let them attack your character?" "Adeline?" she whispered, sliding a legal pad toward me. "Because the opening statements are going to be brutal. They are going to paint you as a monster." I took a breath, holding it in my lungs for a count of 4. "I am ready," I whispered back. Ava nodded. "Good, because they are starting right now." The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, banged her gavel. The sound cracked through the room, signaling the start of the proceedings, but before the opening statements could even begin, a procedural motion from the defense required the review of a piece of media evidence, a broadcast that had aired just that morning, which the defense claimed prejudiced the jury pool. The large monitors mounted on the walls of the courtroom flickered to life. It was a clip from a popular national morning show. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "The Caldwell Saga, Elder Abuse or Greedy Heir." I watched myself on the screen, a grainy photo of me leaving my apartment in Austin, looking tired and disheveled, juxtaposed with a glamorous studio portrait of Richard and Lydia at a charity ball. The commentator's voice filled the courtroom, slick and confident. "We are talking about a woman who hasn't seen her family in 3 years, the pundit said, gesturing wildly. "Adeline Duke returns only when the grandmother's health is failing. Sources close to the family say she has a history of financial instability. She is 31 years old, unmarried, living in a rented apartment, and suddenly she is challenging the power of attorney held by her father, a pillar of the Colorado community. It screams of desperation. It looks like a classic case of a greedy granddaughter trying to secure a payout before the estate is settled. We have to ask, is she mentally stable? There are reports of outbursts in her 20s. I felt the eyes of the jury on me. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. Not shame, anger, pure, distilled anger. On the screen, the image shifted to a clip of Lydia from an old interview. She was speaking softly, her hand on Richard's arm. "Family is everything to us," she was saying. "We just want to protect Evelyn. It is heartbreaking when someone you love loses their way." Lydia, sitting 20 feet away from me, dabbed at a dry eye with a tissue. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. The defense attorney stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, this narrative has poisoned the well. The public sees my clients as victims of a vindictive crusade." I looked at the jury box. 12 strangers, a schoolteacher, a mechanic, a retired nurse, an accountant, normal people. They were looking from the screen to me, and then to the weeping stepmother and the stoic father. I could see the doubt in their eyes. Who wouldn't doubt? The story the media told was clean. It made sense. The rich, successful parents and the black sheep daughter looking for a handout. It was a story as old as time. But it was a lie. I looked down at my hands, resting on the polished oak table. I wasn't wearing gloves. My scars were faint now, faded white lines that disappeared under strong light, but I knew exactly where they were. I could feel the phantom throb of my wrist, the sensation of bone grinding against stone. Ava touched my elbow lightly. "Breathe," she murmured. "Let them talk. The evidence speaks louder." I looked up, past the judge, past the defense table, and straight into the gallery. I saw the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. I saw the sketch artist drawing the curve of Lydia's neck. They thought they were watching a dispute over money. They thought they were watching a squabble over a will. They had no idea. They didn't know about the cold. They didn't know about the silence of the snow in Boulder. They didn't know what it felt like to have your breath hitched in your throat while the person who was supposed to protect you watched you bleed. I looked at Richard. He was still staring at me, his expression unreadable now. Was he remembering? Did he remember the crackling of the logs? Did he remember the smell of pine and expensive scotch? I looked at Grandma Evelyn. She had stopped moving. She was utterly still, like a statue carved from ice. She was waiting. She had been waiting for 3 years, sitting in that care home, playing the part of the senile invalid, waiting for me to be strong enough to stand here. I tightened my jaw. The fear that had been fluttering in my chest began to harden. It solidified into something cold and heavy, like a stone in my stomach. Let them call me greedy. Let them call me unstable. Let them say I am broken. Today, under oath, I was going to strip them naked. I was going to take that perfect, shiny image of the Caldwell family and smash it against the floor of this courtroom. I was going to talk about the Boulder house. I was going to talk about the Christmas party. I was going to tell them about the fireplace. I took a sip of water from the glass on the table. My hand did not shake. The trembling had stopped. The ambient noise of the courtroom faded into a dull buzz. I was no longer the shivering 24-year-old girl begging for approval. I was the storm they had invited in. "Adeline," Ava said, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "The judge is asking if we are ready to proceed with opening arguments." I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that made Richard flinch. I smoothed the front of my charcoal coat. I looked at the judge. Then I looked at the jury, meeting the eyes of the retired nurse in the front row. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, and my voice did not waver. It was strong. It rang off the high ceilings. "We are ready." I sat back down, and as the room settled, I let my mind drift back, not to the media circus outside, not to the lies on the screen, but back to the mountains, back to the snow, back to the night the fire burned hot and bright, and the night I learned that monsters don't live under the bed. They wear silk suits and sit at the head of the table. The trial of the century was about to begin, but the verdict had been written 3 years ago, in the ashes of a fireplace in Boulder, and I was finally ready to read it out loud, to understand the trial, and to understand why I was willing to burn my own name to the ground in a Denver courtroom. You have to go back to the architecture of my cage. You have to go back to Boulder, to the winter of 2018, and to the stone fireplace that served as the altar of the Caldwell family. The house sat on a ridge overlooking the Flatirons, a sprawling structure of timber and glass that cost more than most people earned in 10 lifetimes. It was designed to look rustic, but it was the kind of rustic that smelled of imported leather and floor wax. My father, Richard Caldwell, was the king of mountain real estate. He was the man who had terraformed the Rockies into luxury escapes for the tech billionaires fleeing California. If you lived in the Summit Ridge residences or the Canyon View lofts, you were living in a box Richard built. He was the visionary, and Lydia, my stepmother, was the curator. She was the one who filled those boxes with social currency, hosting the charity galas and the silent auctions that made the Caldwell name synonymous not just with wealth, but with a suffocating kind of benevolence. I was 24 years old that winter. I was not a child. I was a graduate with a degree in finance, working 60-hour weeks, desperate to prove that I was more than just Richard Caldwell's daughter, and I had just done the unthinkable. 3 weeks before Christmas, the company had hit a liquidity crisis. It was a secret. Of course, in the Caldwell world, appearance was the only reality, and admitting cash flow problems was a sin worse than adultery. A bridge loan for the new Phoenix development had stalled. Vendors were threatening to walk. My father had been pacing his study, gray-faced and silent, while Lydia mixed him drinks and whispered about maintaining appearances. So I fixed it. I had an inheritance from my biological mother, a trust that had fully vested when I turned 21. It was everything I had. It was my escape fund, my future, my safety net, and without a contract, without a promissory note, without even a handshake, I had wired $480,000 directly into the Caldwell Properties operating account. I saved the payroll. I saved the vendor contracts. I saved the reputation of the Summit Ridge project. I drove up to the Boulder estate that Christmas Eve with a lightness in my chest I had never felt before. For the first time, I wasn't just the daughter who needed to be managed. I was the partner. I was the savior. I imagined my father pouring me a drink, looking me in the eye, and finally saying the words I had starved for. "Good job, Adeline." I was naive. I was so incredibly, painfully naive. The living room was cavernous, dominated by the massive Riverstone fireplace that stretched 20 feet to the vaulted ceiling. The fire was roaring, consuming logs of birch that popped and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The room was filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins, the hangers-on of the Caldwell Empire, drinking eggnog and admiring the 20-foot tree. Dinner was an exercise in performance art. The table was set with bone china and crystal, the silverware heavy enough to bruise. I sat across from my father. Lydia sat at the foot of the table, wearing a dress of emerald velvet that caught the light of the chandelier. Grandma Evelyn was there, too, pushed to the side in her wheelchair near the heat of the fire. She looked frail, her head trembling slightly, wearing those constant cream-colored leather gloves that she never seemed to take off, even to eat. I waited through the salad course. I waited through the roast duck. I waited for my father to make a toast, to acknowledge the crisis we had just weathered. He stood up, raising his glass of Cabernet. The table went silent. "To family," he said, his voice rich and baritone, "to another year of prosperity, and to Lydia, for organizing the Winter Solstice Gala that raised $50,000 for the arts. We would be lost without your vision. Darling." Everyone clapped. My stomach dropped. I stared at him, willing him to look at me. He didn't. He sat down and took a long swallow of wine. I cleared my throat. It sounded loud in the sudden quiet. "Dad?" I said. Richard looked up, his eyes glazed with a mixture of fatigue and wine. "Yes, Adeline?" "I was thinking," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "Since we are discussing the company's year, maybe we should talk about the Phoenix transition, now that the liquidity issue is resolved?" I saw Lydia's eyes flash. It was a microscopic tightening of the muscles around her mouth, instantly replaced by a mask of pity. "Oh, Adeline," Lydia said, her voice soft and sweet, like honey laced with arsenic. "Let's not bore the guests with business, especially when it is so messy." "It's not messy," I said, looking at my father. "It's solved. I transferred the $480,000 3 weeks ago. The accounts are balanced. I just thought we could discuss my role moving forward. Maybe a position on the board?" The silence that followed was excruciating. My aunt stopped chewing. My cousin lowered his fork. Lydia placed her hand over her heart and let out a small, breathy laugh. "A board position? Oh, sweetie, you have such a big imagination." I frowned, the blood rising to my face. "It's not imagination. Lydia, it's my money. I saved the project." "Richard," Lydia said, turning to my father, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be heard by everyone. "I told you we shouldn't have accepted it. I knew she would get confused about what it meant." "Confused?" I stood up. My legs felt shaky. "I'm not confused. I wired nearly $500,000 to the operating fund. That isn't a gift. Dad, that was an investment. Richard swirled the wine in his glass. He looked at the red liquid as if the answers were written in the sediment. Sit down, Adeline, he said quietly. No, I said. Why are you acting like this? I helped you. Lydia sighed. A long, tragic sound. She looked at the relatives with a mournful expression. You have to forgive her, she said to the table. Adeline has been going through a very unstable period lately. We didn't want to mention it, but that money, we viewed it as a way for her to feel involved, to feel useful. But truthfully, she isn't stable enough to lead. She is fragile. Fragile? I repeated. The word felt like a slap. She makes impulsive financial decisions, Lydia continued, her voice gaining confidence. She is better suited for a background role, perhaps something in the archives or charity coordination. But leadership? No. We have to protect the company from her. Moods. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had built skyscrapers. He had to know this was a lie. He knew I had graduated top of my class. He knew I was the only reason he wasn't declaring bankruptcy in January. Dad? I asked. Tell her I saved us. Richard finally looked at me, but there was no pride in his eyes. There was only annoyance. He was annoyed that I was making a scene. He was annoyed that I was forcing him to choose between his comfort and the truth. Listen to Lydia. Adeline, he said, his voice flat. She knows what is best for the family image. You are emotional. You always have been. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, structural failure of a bridge that had been carrying too much weight for too long. I am not emotional, I said, my voice rising. I am the only one at this table who knows how to read a balance sheet. I want my money back. If I'm not a partner, then treat it as a loan. Pay me back. Lydia stood up then. Her movements were fluid, elegant, and predatory. She walked around the table, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She moved toward the fireplace, beckoning me with a tilt of her head, as if she wanted to have a private word. I stepped away from the table, meeting her near the hearth. The heat from the fire was intense, flushing my skin. You are embarrassing your father, Lydia hissed, her voice low now, stripped of the sweetness. I want my money, Lydia, I said, gritting my teeth. You don't have any money. She smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. You gave it to the company. There is no contract. There is no loan agreement. It was a donation from a loving daughter, and if you try to sue, we will bury you. We will show the court your therapy records from college. We will paint you as a manic, ungrateful child who needs a conservatorship. She was so close to me I could smell her perfume, Chanel and stale wine. You are a thief, I spat out. Lydia's face twisted. The mask fell completely. This wasn't the socialite anymore. This was the street fighter who had clawed her way into the Caldwell fortune. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. It wasn't a gentle hold. Her fingers, strong from years of tennis and Pilates, dug into the soft flesh of my forearm. She yanked me forward, off balance, pulling me toward the jagged stone edge of the fireplace hearth. I gasped, stumbling. I was 24, taller than her, but the shock of the violence paralyzed me. She twisted my arm, grinding the bones of my wrist together. It was a specific, calculated kind of pain, sharp, immediate, and hidden from the view of the dinner table by her own body. You are nothing, she whispered, her face inches from mine. You are a guest in this house. You are a guest in this family. You will sit down. You will shut up, and you will be grateful we let you breathe the same air. My wrist burned. The fire crackled loudly, popping a spark onto the rug nearby. I looked over Lydia's shoulder at the table. My father was watching. He saw her grab me. He saw the grimace of pain on my face. He saw his wife physically assaulting his daughter. And he turned his head. He picked up his wine glass and looked at the wall. The aunts and uncles studied their plates. My cousins suddenly found the pattern of the tablecloth fascinating. No one moved. No one spoke. I was alone in a room full of blood relatives. Lydia squeezed harder, her nails digging in, likely drawing blood. "Do you understand me?" she demanded. Tears pricked my eyes, not from the pain, but from the humiliation, the absolute, crushing realization that I had no father, I had no family. I was just a resource to be mined and discarded. "Yes," I choked out. She released me with a shove. I stumbled back, catching myself on the arm of a leather chair. I rubbed my wrist. It was already turning red, the white distinct marks of her fingers fading into a deep, angry bruise. Lydia smoothed her velvet dress, patted her hair, and turned back to the guests with a bright, tight smile. "I think Adeline needs some fresh air. She is feeling a bit overwrought." I stood there, trembling, the heat of the fire scorching my back, the chill of the room freezing my heart. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, but I knew, with a sinking certainty, that if I did, they would only use it as proof of my insanity. I turned to leave, my vision blurred. "Wait." The voice was crackly, unused, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. I stopped. Lydia stopped. Richard paused with his glass halfway to his mouth. Grandma Evelyn was standing up. It was a slow, agonizing process. She gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles straining under the leather gloves. She hadn't stood on her own in 2 years. Her legs shook, her spine was bent, but she pushed herself up, inch by inch, until she was vertical. "Mother," Richard said, half rising, "sit down. You'll fall." Evelyn ignored him. She ignored Lydia. She shuffled forward, her feet dragging slightly on the Persian rug. The room was deadly silent. The only sound was the fire and the labored breathing of an 80-year-old woman. She walked toward me. It took her a long time. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. I didn't move. I was mesmerized. When she reached me, she didn't look at my face. She looked at my wrist. She looked at the red marks Lydia had left there. Then, she raised her eyes to mine. They were cloudy, rimmed with red, but behind the cataract haze, there was a spark of something ancient and terrifyingly sharp. She lifted her left hand. With her teeth, she grabbed the fingertips of the cream leather glove on her right hand. She pulled. The leather slid off. It was a slow reveal. Her hand was gnarled, the veins blue and prominent, the skin paper-thin. It was the hand of a woman who had lived through wars and loss. She dropped the glove onto the floor. It landed with a soft, defeated thud. Then, she reached out and took my bruised hand in hers. Her skin was dry and warm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She leaned in close, pulling me down slightly so her lips brushed my ear. She smelled of lavender and old paper. "Remember this feeling," she whispered. Her voice was a steel wire. "Burn it into your memory, child. You will need it later." I frowned, confused, tears finally spilling onto my cheeks. "Grandma?" I whispered back. She squeezed my hand harder, and as she did, I felt something slide from her palm into mine. It was small, it was hard, it was cold, metal. I closed my fingers around it instinctively. It felt like a key, a small, flat key, the kind you might use for a diary or a jewelry box. "Keep it hidden," she breathed. She pulled back, releasing my hand. I quickly shoved my fist into the pocket of my cardigan, my heart hammering against my ribs. Grandma Evelyn turned then. She didn't look at Richard. She turned her entire body to face Lydia. Lydia was watching us with a look of suspicion, her eyes narrowing. "What are you saying to her?" "Evelyn?" Lydia asked sharply. Grandma didn't speak. She just looked at Lydia, and then, for the briefest second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a sweet smile. It wasn't a senile smile. It was a smile of pure, calculated malice. It was the smile of a chess player who sees a mate in 10 moves when the opponent thinks the game has just started. She turned back to the fire, staring into the flames, her bare hand hanging by her side, the other still gloved. I didn't understand. I touched the cold metal in my pocket. I looked at the bruise forming on my wrist. I looked at my father, who was pouring another drink to drown out the tension. I didn't know then that Grandma had just handed me the weapon that would kill the Caldwell legacy. I didn't know that the domino had just been tipped. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, someone in this house had seen me. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. Stepping into the cold hallway, clutching that tiny piece of metal as if it were a lifeline, because it was. 3 years is a long time to hold your breath. I left Boulder 72 hours after the night at the fireplace. I packed 2 suitcases, drained my savings account, which was pitifully small after I had emptied the bulk of it into my father's company, and drove south until the mountains flattened into plains and the air turned humid and thick. I ended up in Austin, Texas. It was not a calculated choice. It was simply where the gas in my tank ran out and where the rent for a studio apartment seemed manageable. Now, at 27, I had rebuilt myself. I was no longer the desperate daughter begging for a seat at the table. I was a senior strategy specialist for Northline Habitat Group, a boutique urban development firm that appreciated precision over pedigree. My apartment was a loft in East Austin with polished concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Colorado River. It was stark, modern, and intentionally devoid of clutter. There were no heavy drapes, there were no Persian rugs, and most importantly, there was no fireplace. I lived a life of aggressive minimalism. My walls were white, my furniture was low and angular. I controlled everything within these 4 walls. I controlled the temperature, the lighting, and the silence. But trauma has a way of living in the body, hiding in the marrow even when the mind thinks it has moved on. Sometimes, when I was dining out with colleagues, and a waiter would strike a long match to light a candle at the table, the sound, that sharp, sulphurous hiss and crackle, would send a phantom pain shooting through my left wrist. I would freeze, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth, transported back to the smell of burning birch and the crushing grip of Lydia's hand. I would hear the pop of the sap in the wood, and I would feel small again. I would feel like the guest in my own life. I dated a few men, but it never lasted. They found me distant. They said I held a part of myself back, locked behind a door they couldn't find the key to. They were right. I was hoarding my autonomy like a miser hoards gold. I had spent 24 years trying to please a father who saw me as a liability, and I was not about to hand over the deed to my soul to anyone else. The only thread that still tethered me to the Caldwell name was Grandma Evelyn. She had been moved shortly after I left. Richard had placed her in Santa Fe Pines Care, a high-end facility in New Mexico. It was supposed to be the best in the Southwest, a place of adobe walls and turquoise skies, but to me, it felt like a prison. I tried to visit. In the first year, I drove to Santa Fe 3 times. Each time, I was stopped at the front desk. "Mr. Caldwell has left strict instructions," the administrator would say, their smile practiced and apologetic. "Your grandmother is having a bad day. She is confused. Agitation is bad for her heart. It is better if you come back another time." I called my father. He wouldn't answer. I called Lydia. She would answer, her voice dripping with that toxic sweetness. "Oh, Adeline," she would say, "Evelyn doesn't even know who we are half the time. Why do you want to upset her? Let her rest. You are so selfish to prioritize your guilt over her peace." Eventually, I stopped driving. I stopped calling the house. I sent cards to the facility, generic landscapes with simple messages. Unsure if she ever received them, I assumed she was lost to the fog of dementia. Just as they said, I assumed the woman who had squeezed my hand and passed me that key was gone, replaced by a shell. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday in late October when the box arrived. I had come home late from the office, my mind occupied with a zoning dispute for a new mixed-use project on South Congress. The hallway of my building was quiet, the air conditioning humming a low, steady note. The box was sitting on my doormat. It was a small, gray cardboard shipping box, about the size of a shoebox. There were no stamps. There was no shipping label from FedEx or UPS. It had not been mailed. Someone had placed it there. I stood in the hallway, my key halfway to my lock, staring at it, My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I looked down the hall. Empty. I crouched down. On the top of the box, written in black marker, was my name. Adeline. The handwriting was shaky. The letters were jagged, the lines trailing off at the ends, as if the hand holding the pen had been fighting a tremor. But the loops of the A and the sharp cross of the T were unmistakable. I had seen that handwriting on birthday checks and Christmas cards for 2 decades. Underneath my name, in smaller, more labored script, were 5 words. Only open when you are alone. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and threw the deadbolt and the chain lock. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I walked to the kitchen island, guided only by the glow of the city lights filtering in through the windows. I set the box down on the quartz counter. I poured myself a glass of red wine, my hand trembling slightly. I took a long sip, the liquid coating my throat, grounding me. I used a steak knife to slice the packing tape. The flaps sprang open. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled newspaper, pages from the Santa Fe New Mexican dated 2 days ago, sat an object that sucked the air out of the room. It was the music box. It was an antique, silver-plated box with intricate engravings of vines and roses. For as long as I could remember, it had sat on the mantel of the fireplace in Boulder, right next to the carriage clock. It had been there the night Lydia grabbed me. It had been a silent witness to my humiliation. I reached in and lifted it out. The silver was tarnished, duller than I remembered. Lydia would never have allowed tarnished silver in her house. That meant this had been gone from the mantel for a while. I ran my thumb over the latch. I didn't open it yet. Below the music box was a thick cream-colored envelope and a small object wrapped in tissue paper. I unwrapped the tissue first. It was a key. It wasn't the flat key she had given me 3 years ago. That one was still on my keychain, disguised among my apartment fob and my office keys. A mystery I had never solved. This key was different. It was made of copper, old and heavy, with a round bow and a complex, 3-pronged bit. It looked like a skeleton key for a piece of furniture, perhaps a cabinet or a desk. I set the copper key next to the silver music box, metal on stone. Then, I picked up the envelope. It was sealed with wax, a pretension that was purely Evelyn. I broke the seal. The letter inside was written on the stationery of the Santa Fe Pines Care Facility, but the handwriting was chaotic, slanting aggressively to the right. Adeline. If you are reading this, it means I do not have much time left. The fog is getting thicker, or perhaps they are just increasing the dosage. I cannot tell the days apart anymore. Do not come here. They will not let you in. They are watching the doors. I know you think I abandoned you that night. I know you think I am just a helpless old woman. Let them think that too. It is our only advantage. You have the key I gave you that night. Now you have the second key. The truth is not in your father's safe. It is not in the bank. The truth is in the stone wall by the fireplace, the one in Boulder, the one that burned while you cried. Lydia thinks she has erased everything. She thinks paper can be shredded and files can be deleted. She forgot that I built that house before she was even born. I know its bones. Do not trust any paper that does not have my handwriting on it. Do not trust the will Richard shows you. Do not trust the doctors they hired. Go to the wall. Find the hollow. Use the first key. This copper key opens the box inside the wall. Inside that box is your life, Adeline, and it is the end of theirs. I love you. I have always loved you. Forgive me for taking so long to put on my gloves. Grandma Evelyn. I put the letter down. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The silence of my apartment, usually a comfort, now felt heavy and charged. I looked at the music box. I looked at the copper key. The stone wall by the fireplace. Suddenly, the layout of the Boulder living room flooded my mind. I saw the massive river stones, rugged and uneven. I remembered how, as a child, I used to run my fingers along the grout lines. There was a specific stone, about waist high, to the right of the hearth, that always felt slightly loose. I had thought it was just shoddy masonry. Grandma Evelyn hadn't just given me a pep talk that night. She hadn't just given me a trinket. She had given me the first half of a map. But how? How had she gotten this box to me? She was in a wheelchair, monitored by staff paid by my father. I looked at the crumpled newspaper packing. It was the local Santa Fe paper. Someone had helped her, maybe a nurse, a janitor, someone she had charmed or bribed. It meant she wasn't completely isolated. It meant she was still fighting. And she was lucid. The letter wasn't the rambling of a dementia patient. It was sharp. Let them think that. It is our only advantage. She had been playing a role for 3 years, or maybe longer. She had let them treat her like an invalid. Let them talk about her as if she wasn't there, all to buy time, to protect whatever was in that wall. I picked up the music box and wound the key at the bottom. The mechanism clicked. A sound of resistance and release. I opened the lid. The tinkling. Mechanical notes of Greensleeves drifted into the quiet air of the loft. It was a sad, mournful tune. Alas, my love, you do me wrong, to cast me off discourteously. The irony wasn't lost on me. I sat there for an hour, watching the lights of the Austin skyline blur as my mind raced. I had a life here. I had a career. I was safe. But I wasn't free. As long as Lydia and Richard held the strings, as long as they controlled the narrative of my instability and Grandma's illness, I was just a fugitive. The phone rang. It was jarring, a harsh digital trill that shattered the mood. I looked at the screen. It was a Colorado area code. I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Lydia. Hello? I answered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my blood. Is this Adeline Duke? A woman's voice asked. She sounded professional, tired. Yes, who is this? This is Dr. Eris Thorne. I am calling from the emergency neurology unit at Boulder Community Health. Boulder? My stomach dropped. Why are you calling from Boulder? My grandmother is in Santa Fe. She was transferred this morning via private ambulance. The doctor said, Ms. Duke, your grandmother, Evelyn Caldwell, suffered a transient ischemic attack, a mild stroke. I stood up, gripping the edge of the counter. Is she okay? Can I speak to her? She is stable, but sedated. Dr. Thorne said. However, that is not why I am calling. I am calling because you are listed as her next of kin in her old files. But what? I demanded. But her son, Richard Caldwell, and his wife have just arrived. They presented a medical power of attorney document that grants Lydia Caldwell full decision-making authority over Evelyn's care. I closed my eyes. Lydia, who had bruised my wrist. Lydia, who wanted Grandma gone. That power of attorney is a lie, I said, my voice rising. My grandmother would never sign that. Doctor, Thorne paused. The document looks legal. Ms. Duke, it is notarized, and Mrs. Caldwell has already issued instructions. She wants to move Evelyn to a private hospice facility in the mountains as soon as she is discharged. She has restricted all visitors, and she has specifically removed your name from the approved contact list. I am only calling you because your grandmother was asking for Addie before the sedation took hold. A private hospice in the mountains, that was code for a hole where people went to disappear. If Lydia moved her there, I would never see her again, and whatever was in that wall, Lydia would find it eventually, or she would destroy the house to find it. I need you to stop them, I said. I can't, Doctor, Thorne said gently, unless you have a more recent legal document. Mrs. Caldwell is the guardian. I have to follow her orders. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. I looked at the copper key. I looked at the letter. Do not trust any paper that does not have my handwriting on it. Lydia had made her move. She was going to bury the witness. I walked to my closet. I pulled down my suitcase. I didn't bother folding my clothes. I threw in sweaters, jeans, boots. I wasn't the strategist for Northline Habitat Group anymore. I wasn't the scared girl by the fireplace. I zipped the suitcase shut. The sound was like a zipper on a body bag. I walked back to the kitchen, grabbed the silver music box, the copper key, and the letter. I shoved them into my carry-on. I had a flight to catch, and after that, I had a wall to break down. Adeline Duke was going home. I requested an indefinite leave of absence from Northline Habitat Group via email while sitting in the departure lounge of Austin Bergstrom International Airport. I did not wait for a reply. My career, which had been the singular pillar of my existence for 3 years, suddenly felt like a brittle exoskeleton I was shedding. I had a suitcase full of sweaters, a copper key in my pocket, and a burning need to find out what was hidden behind a stone wall in Boulder. When I landed in Denver, the altitude hit me instantly. That thin, crisp air that makes your lungs work a little harder. It tasted like home, and it tasted like danger. I avoided the rental counters that catered to tourists and businessmen. Instead, I took a shuttle to a budget lot on the outskirts of the airport and rented a beige sedan with 60,000 miles on the odometer and a faint smell of stale cigarette smoke embedded in the upholstery. It was anonymous. It was invisible. It was perfect. I did not drive to Boulder, not yet. I drove to the address I had found in the public records for Sunrise Mesa Care. It was located in a suburb north of Denver, a sprawling complex of stucco and tile that tried to look like a resort but smelled, as all these places do, of industrial cleaner and pureed food. The receptionist was a young woman with bright pink acrylic nails who looked bored. I approached the desk with the confidence of a woman who belonged there, despite the pounding in my chest. "I am here to see Evelyn Caldwell." I said, "I am her granddaughter, Adeline." The girl clicked her mouse a few times, her gums snapping softly. Use of the computer seemed to require immense effort. "Caldwell?" She frowned. "I have a note here says, restricted visitors, only Mr. and Mrs. Richard Caldwell." I leaned in, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know. My father sent me. He forgot to bring her favorite shawl when they transferred her yesterday. He's meeting me here in an hour. But he wanted me to get her settled first. You know how he gets when things aren't perfect." I mentioned Richard's name with just enough fear in my voice to make it believable. Everyone in Denver knew Richard Caldwell could be difficult. The girl hesitated, then shrugged. "Room 104, down the hall, left at the vending machines, but make it quick. Rounds start in 20 minutes. I walked down the hallway, my boots silent on the linoleum. Room 104 was at the end of a long corridor. The door was open a crack. I pushed it open. Grandma Evelyn was sitting in her wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if her physical form was evaporating, leaving only the fierce spirit inside. She was wearing a hospital gown with a cardigan thrown over it, and on her hands, she still wore those cream leather gloves. I stepped inside and closed the door. "Grandma?" Her head snapped toward me. For a moment, her eyes were vacant, cloudy with age and medication. She blinked, her mouth working silently. "The nurse?" she croaked. "I don't want the pudding. It tastes like chalk." "It's me, Grandma," I whispered, kneeling beside her chair. "It is Adeline." She stared at me. Her gaze drifted over my face, tracing my hairline, my jaw. Then, clarity slammed into her eyes like a thunderclap. The vacuous expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, terrifying intelligence. "You came," she whispered. Her voice was stronger now. "Did you find the box?" I nodded, gripping the armrest of her wheelchair. "I found it. I have the copper key. But the letter, you said the truth is in the wall." "What truth? Grandma?" She leaned forward, looking at the door with paranoia. "Not here. They listen. Lydia pays the night nurse. She pays everyone." She grabbed my hand. Her gloved fingers were strong. "Listen to me, Adeline. You need to find Martin." "Martin? Martin Hale? The family lawyer?" She nodded feverishly. "He knows. He wrote the real trust. The one I signed before the stroke in 2010. The one Richard burned." "Grandma, Martin Hale disappeared 10 years ago," I said gently. "There was a car accident. They never found him. Everyone thinks he's dead." "No!" she hissed, her eyes wide. Not dead. Hiding. He was scared. Richard threatened his daughter. Martin ran. He left something for you. He told me. If the wolves come, tell Adeline to find Hazel. Hazel? I racked my brain. Martin's old secretary? The woman who used to give me peppermints when I waited in the lobby? Find Hazel, Evelyn commanded, her voice dropping as footsteps approached in the hall. She is in Greeley. She works at a market. Tell her the gloves are off. Tell her that exactly. The door handle turned. Immediately, Grandma Evelyn slumped back in her chair, her mouth going slack, her eyes unfocusing. "Where is my soup?" she wailed, her voice high and thin. "I want tomato soup." A nurse bustled in, looking annoyed. "Ms. Caldwell, please keep it down." "Oh," she stopped, seeing me. "Who are you?" I stood up, smoothing my coat. I was just leaving. I think she's confused. She thinks I'm the kitchen staff. I walked out before the nurse could ask for ID, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Find Hazel. Greeley. The gloves are off." Greeley was an hour north, a drive through flat plains that smelled of cattle feedlots and dust. It was a working-class town, a world away from the manicured lawns of Boulder. I found Hazel's name in an old phone directory archive online. Hazel Miller. Address listed near a small strip mall. I found her working the register at a place called Daily Mart, a cramped convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights. She was older now, her hair gray and pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a blue smock that smelled of disinfectant. I waited until the store was empty. I walked up to the counter and placed a bottle of water on the scuffed surface. "Hazel?" I asked. She didn't look up from scanning the bottle. "That will be $1.50. "I am Adeline Duke," I said quietly. "Evelyn Caldwell sent me. She said to tell you the gloves are off." Hazel froze. Her hand hovered over the cash drawer. She looked up slowly, and I saw recognition and fear war in her eyes. She looked at the security camera in the corner, then back at me. She didn't say a word. She finished the transaction, her hands shaking slightly. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out a pack of gum, and slid it across the counter to me. "I didn't ask for this," I said. "Take it," she snapped, her voice low and harsh. "Go. Don't come back here." I grabbed the gum and the water and walked out. I sat in my rental car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I opened the pack of gum. Inside, wedged between the foil wrappers, was a small, black USB drive. It looked old, the plastic casing scratched. I drove to a motel off the highway, avoiding the major chains. I checked into a room that smelled of lemon polish and despair. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my laptop, and plugged in the drive. There was only one file, an audio file labeled Insurance AMMH 250 Wave. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The voice that filled my ears was familiar, but broken. It was Martin Hale, the man who had bounced me on his knee when I was 5, but he sounded terrified. He sounded like a man recording his last testament. "My name is Martin Hale. If you are listening to this, then I am likely dead, or I have run so far that I can never come back." There was a pause, the sound of a glass clinking, liquid being poured. I need to state for the record what happened on November 14th, 2010. I was summoned to the Caldwell estate by Richard and Lydia. They had found out about the new trust structure Evelyn had commissioned. I closed my eyes, visualizing the scene. Evelyn wanted the bulk of the estate, including the primary shares of Caldwell Properties, to go into a protected trust for her granddaughter, Adeline, upon her 25th birthday. Martin's voice continued. She did not trust Richard. She knew he was leveraging the company assets to cover personal gambling debts in Vegas. She knew Lydia was siphoning cash into shell companies. My breath caught. Gambling debts? Shell companies? "They cornered me in the library," Martin said, his voice trembling. Richard had a Fireplace poker in his hand. Lydia was worse. She was calm. She told me that if I filed that trust, they would release photos, doctored photos, things that would destroy my reputation. ruin my family, and likely send me to prison for things I never did. They told me I had to draft a new power of attorney, one that gave Lydia full medical and financial control over Evelyn if she ever became incapacitated. There was a sound of a sob on the recording, a man weeping. I did it. God help me. I did it. But I saw something else. 2 weeks later, I went back to finalize the papers. I saw Lydia sitting at the desk in the study. She was practicing Evelyn's signature. She had pages and pages of it. She was signing transfer deeds for the Summit Ridge land. Evelyn was in the garden. She had no idea. The audio hissed with static. I confronted Lydia. She laughed. She said, "Martin, old people get confused. I am just helping her remember what she wants." Then Richard came in. He told me that accidents happen on mountain roads all the time. He mentioned my daughter's school bus route. I felt cold all over. They hadn't just bullied him, they had threatened his child. "I am running," Martin whispered, "but I made copies. I hid the original trust document where Evelyn asked me to, and I am leaving this drive with Hazel. She is the only one I trust. If you are listening to this, Adeline, find the wall, find the document, and burn them down." The recording ended. I sat in the silence of the motel room, the hum of the mini-fridge the only sound. This wasn't just a family dispute. This wasn't just a stepmother being cruel. This was racketeering. This was extortion. This was fraud on a massive scale. They had intimidated a witness, forged legal documents, and systematically dismantled my grandmother's agency to rob me of my inheritance. They had turned my father's company into a criminal enterprise. And the worst part? My father had held the poker. He had stood there while his wife threatened to ruin a man's life. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. Hot and angry, I wiped it away. There was no time for crying. Crying was for the girl by the fireplace. I was the woman with the evidence. I opened my browser. I searched for a name I had seen on the news during my time in Austin. A woman who was making waves in Denver for her aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime and elder abuse. Ava Morales, Assistant United States Attorney. I found her public email address. It was a long shot, but I didn't have time for channels. I drafted a new email. Subject: Evidence of federal fraud and elder abuse, the Caldwell estate. Ms. Morales. My name is Adeline Duke. I am the granddaughter of Evelyn Caldwell and the daughter of Richard Caldwell. I am in possession of a digital confession from a missing attorney, Martin Hale, alleging extortion, forgery, and wire fraud committed by Richard and Lydia Caldwell. I also have evidence that my grandmother is being held against her will and chemically restrained to prevent her from testifying. They think this is a civil probate matter. It is not. It is a federal crime. Attached is the audio file and a scan of a letter from my grandmother. I am going to get the physical evidence. I need you to be ready. Adeline. I hit send. I stared at the screen as the progress bar moved. Sent. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. My beat-up rental car sat under the orange glow of a street lamp. The sun was setting over the Rockies, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. I knew Lydia was probably moving Grandma right now. I knew Richard was probably drinking scotch, thinking he had won. They didn't know I had the ghost of Martin Hale in my pocket. They didn't know I had made a new friend in the U.S. Attorney's office. I packed my bag. I wasn't staying in this motel. I needed to be closer to Boulder. I needed to be ready to strike. The hunt was over. The war had begun. The Byron Rogers Federal Building in downtown Denver was a fortress of concrete and glass, a stark contrast to the ornate, wood-paneled deceit of the Caldwell estate. I walked through the security checkpoint, surrendering my phone and belt, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my pocket like a stone. Assistant United States Attorney Ava Morales was waiting for me on the 4th floor. Her office was small, cramped with boxes of files that reached halfway to the ceiling, smelling of stale coffee and high-stakes litigation. Ava herself was a force of nature contained within a navy blazer. She had sharp features, eyes that missed nothing, and a handshake that offered no pity, only capability. "Sit down," Adeline, she said, sweeping a stack of manila folders off a chair. Let's see what you have. I placed the items on her desk. The USB drive I had retrieved from Hazel and Greeley, the handwritten letter from Grandma Evelyn, and the printed spreadsheets I had reconstructed from my memory of the Caldwell Properties server and the physical files I had scanned before leaving Austin. We started with the audio. I watched Ava's face as Martin Hale's trembling voice filled the small room. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers, her expression unreadable. When the recording reached the part about Richard holding the fireplace poker and Lydia threatening Martin's daughter, Ava's jaw tightened. She didn't say a word until the track ended with Martin's desperate plea to burn them down. She clicked stop. The silence that followed was heavy. "This is not just a civil dispute over a will," Ava said, her voice low and dangerous. "No," I said, "it is extortion." "It is more than that," Ava corrected. Leaning forward, she pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing furiously. "If they use the threat of violence to coerce a lawyer into falsifying federal trust documents, that is a Hobbs Act violation. If they use the mail or interstate wire transfers to move the assets they stole from your grandmother, that is wire fraud. And since they did it repeatedly over a period of 10 years involving multiple people, we are looking at a pattern." She looked up at me, her dark eyes intense. "Adeline, if we can prove this, we are not talking about a fine. We are talking about 15 to 20 years in federal prison, for both of them." I felt a shiver go through me. I didn't want their money. I didn't even want the house. I wanted justice for the woman sitting in a wheelchair wearing gloves to hide her bruises. I pulled the spreadsheets forward. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a highlighted column. "This is the Evelyn Charitable Trust. It was established in 1998 to support arts education. It had assets of $12 million. Ava put on a pair of reading glasses. "Go on." "Starting in 2011, right after Martin disappeared, the disbursements changed," I explained, tracing the line with my finger. "Instead of going to the Denver Art Museum or the opera, the money started flowing to Blue Spruce Consulting and Highland Management LLC. "Shell companies?" Ava asked. I nodded. I looked them up. The registered agent for Blue Spruce is a P.O. box in Nevada. But the wire transfers matched the exact dates my father had capital calls for the Summit Ridge development. He was draining Grandma's charity fund to pay for his construction loans. And Lydia, look at these withdrawals. Medical management fees, $10,000 a month, to a company owned by her brother. Ava whistled low. Embezzlement, laundering, and they did it all while holding power of attorney over a vulnerable elder. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline. "This is a solid foundation. Adeline, but it is all paper. Juries get bored with paper. We need to tie the financial crimes to the physical abuse. We need to prove that Evelyn was not just confused, but that she was systematically silenced." She turned back to me. "I am authorizing a federal inquiry. I will send a team of inspectors from the Department of Health and Human Services to the Sunrise Mesa Care Facility tomorrow morning. They will audit the medication logs. If Lydia is over-sedating her, we will find out." "Can you get her out?" I asked, hope rising in my chest. "Not yet," Ava said, "not without a judge's order. And to get that, I need to prove immediate danger, right now. Lydia has a valid-looking power of attorney. If we move too fast, they will lawyer up and hide her somewhere we can't find her." She looked at the clock. "Go back to your hotel. Get some rest. Do not call your father. Do not call the facility. Let my team do their job." I left the federal building feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't just the crazy daughter. I was a witness for the United States government. I decided to stop by the short-term rental apartment I had booked in the Highlands neighborhood to change clothes and grab a bite to eat. It was a small garden-level unit, private and quiet, or at least, it was supposed to be. When I pulled up to the curb, I saw the front door. It was standing ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, shards of white paint scattered on the welcome mat. My stomach dropped. I didn't think. I ran to the door, pushing it open. The apartment had been tossed. It wasn't a robbery, it was a demolition. The sofa cushions were slashed open, stuffing bleeding out onto the floor. The drawers of the kitchenette were pulled out and dumped. My suitcase was overturned, clothes strewn everywhere. My laptop, which I had left on the coffee table, was smashed. The screen was shattered, the keyboard bent in half as if someone had taken a hammer to it. But my eyes flew to the bedside table. Before I left for the meeting, I had taken the silver music box out of my bag. I had left it there, along with the copper key, thinking they were safer in the apartment than in my purse while I walked through downtown Denver. It was a stupid sentimental mistake. The table was empty. No. I scrambled through the mess, throwing clothes aside, checking under the bed, checking the bathroom. Gone. The silver music box was gone. The copper key, the key to the wall, the key to the truth, was gone. I stood in the middle of the wreckage, my hands shaking. They had taken it. Lydia. It had to be Lydia. She knew. She knew I had come back, and she knew exactly what Grandma had sent me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed Ava's number. They were here, I gasped when she answered. They broke in. Are you safe? Ava's voice was instant, sharp. Are you in the apartment? Yes. I mean, no one is here. But they took it. Ava. They took the music box and the key. They smashed my laptop. They took all the physical papers I printed out. Adeline, listen to me, Ava said, her voice calm and steadying. Get out of there. Go to your car. Lock the doors. Do you have the files? Yes, I stammered, backing out of the apartment. I scanned everything to an encrypted cloud server before I left Austin. The financial records, the letter, the audio. It is all digital. Good, Ava said. Then they accomplished nothing. They just added breaking and entering and obstruction of justice to their charge sheet. But the key, I cried, sitting in the driver's seat of my rental car and locking the doors. The copper key. It opens the box in the wall. Without it, we can't get the original will. We will find a way, Ava said. We can get a locksmith with a warrant. Adeline, the fact that they did this proves they are terrified. They are reacting. They are sloppy. A text message pinged on my phone. I pulled it away from my ear to look. It was from an unknown number, no caller ID. It was an image. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a photo of Grandma Evelyn. She was asleep in her wheelchair, her head lolling to the side. But it wasn't at the care home. I recognized the background. It was a log wall, a stone floor. On the table next to her lay her cream-colored gloves, and next to the gloves was a hand, a manicured hand with a large diamond ring, resting ominously on the armrest of the wheelchair. Below the image was a text. She looks so peaceful when she sleeps. Don't drag her into this mess. Adeline, the stress might be too much for her heart. Go back to Austin. I stared at the screen, horror washing over me. They had moved her. They had taken her out of the facility before the inspectors could arrive. Ava? I whispered, my voice breaking. They have her. They sent me a picture. Send it to me, Ava commanded. Right now. I forwarded the message. Seconds later, Ava spoke, her tone icy. Okay, the gloves are off for us too. She is at the lodge, I said, recognizing the timber in the photo. The Silver Hearth Lodge, our vacation home near Silvercrest. It is isolated. It is miles from anywhere. Adeline, come back to my office, Ava said. Don't go there. If you go there alone, you are playing their game. I can't just leave her. We aren't leaving her, Ava said. We are going to save her. But we need to be smart. The key to this entire case is behind that wall in Boulder. But the leverage is Lydia herself. What do you mean? Ava paused. I can't get a search warrant for the Boulder house based on a 10-year-old audio recording and a stolen key. A judge will say it is hearsay. I need probable cause that is fresh. I need Lydia to admit she knows what is in that wall. Or I need her to admit she is manipulating Evelyn right now. So what do we do? I asked, watching the flashing lights of a police cruiser turn the corner, likely responding to the silent alarm of the apartment complex. Ava's voice was hard as flint. We need a confession, and the only way to get a confession from a narcissist like Lydia Caldwell is to make her think she has already won. We need her to invite you in. We need her to gloat, and when she does, we will be listening. But the key, I said, feeling the phantom weight of it missing from my pocket. Forget the key for a moment, Ava said. The key is just metal. The truth is the weapon. Come to my office. We are going to wire you up. If they want a family reunion, Adeline, we are going to give them one they will never forget. The email arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon, glowing on my phone screen like a digital summons. From Richard Caldwell. Subject, Family Matters. Adeline. This has gone far enough. The lawyers, the threats, the federal inquiries. You are tearing this family apart over a misunderstanding. Your grandmother is resting comfortably at the Silver Hearth Lodge. She is asking for you. Come up this evening, just us. No lawyers, no government agents. If you want to see her, you will come alone. We can settle this like family, not like enemies. Dad. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my wrist. It was a classic play. Isolate the victim, remove the legal shield, use the hostage, Grandma Evelyn, as leverage to force a negotiation. I handed the phone to Ava Morales. She read it twice, her expression darkening. Then she looked up at the map of the Colorado Rockies pinned to her office wall. Silver Hearth Lodge, she murmured. That is near Silvercrest, isn't it? It is isolated. Miles of national forest on all sides. One road in, one road out. It is a fortress, I said. My father built it 10 years ago as a winter retreat. It has a security system that rivals a bank vault. If I go there, I am walking into a cage. Ava nodded, tapping a pen against her desk. Yes, you are, but that is exactly what we need. She stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against the edge, crossing her arms. We cannot get a warrant for the lodge based on a text message photo, Ava explained. But if you are invited in, and if you can get them to admit, on tape, that they are holding Evelyn against her will, or that they forged those documents, or that they know about the money laundering, then we have them. She looked me dead in the eye. Adeline, I can't send an agent in. They will know. It has to be you. I took a deep breath. I felt the phantom grip on my wrist again. The memory of the fireplace. I have to go in there alone? Not entirely, Ava said. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, flat black case. We are going to wire you. Audio and GPS. I will have a tactical team stationed 2 miles down the mountain road in an unmarked van. If the signal cuts out, or if you say the safe word, we breach the door. What is the safe word? I asked. Gloves, Ava said, a faint smile touching her lips. I spent the next 2 hours in a small briefing room, letting a federal technician tape a battery pack to the small of my back and thread a wire under my thermal undershirt. The microphone was tiny, hidden beneath the collar of my heavy wool sweater. You have to act the part, Ava instructed as I put my coat back on. You cannot be the confident woman who walked into my office. You cannot be the strategist. You have to be the daughter they remember, the one they broke. I nodded, practicing the slump of my shoulders in the mirror. I have to be scared. I have to be desperate. You have to be the victim, Ava corrected. Narcissists get sloppy when they think they have won. If you challenge them, they will wall up. If you beg, they will gloat. And when they gloat, they confess. By 4 o'clock, I was in my rental car, driving west on Interstate 70. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unshed snow, as I turned off the highway onto the winding state road that led toward Silvercrest. The first flakes began to fall, large, wet clumps that stuck to the windshield. I checked the rearview mirror. A black SUV was behind me. It had been there since the exit. It was keeping a steady distance, about 5 car lengths back. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windshield, but the car moved with a predatory precision. It didn't pass when the road widened. It didn't slow down when I tapped my brakes. Paranoia, cold and sharp, pricked at the back of my neck. Was it them? Had Richard sent private security to make sure I didn't detour? Or was it Ava's team? I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. The tires crunched over the fresh powder. The pine trees on either side of the road were tall and dark, standing like sentinels guarding the secrets of the valley. The GPS on my dashboard glowed. Destination in 2 miles. The Silver Hearth Lodge emerged from the twilight like a dark beast. It was a massive structure of timber and stone, sitting on a rise that overlooked the valley. Smoke curled from the main chimney, disappearing into the gray sky. It was beautiful in the way a poisonous flower is beautiful. I pulled up to the heavy iron gates. They swung open automatically, sensing my arrival, or perhaps opened by someone watching from the window. I drove up the heated driveway, the snow melting instantly on the pavement. I parked next to my father's Range Rover. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Showtime. Adeline. I messed up my hair slightly. I rubbed my eyes to make them look red and tired. I hunched my shoulders. Then, I opened the door and stepped out into the biting cold. The front door of the lodge was solid oak, 8 feet tall. Before I could knock, it swung open. Lydia stood there. She was wearing a cashmere sweater the color of oatmeal and white trousers that looked impossibly clean for the setting. She held a crystal wine glass in one hand. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. "Adeline," she cooed. She stepped forward and wrapped me in a hug. She smelled of expensive vanilla and the metallic tang of cold air. Her body was stiff, the embrace purely performative. I stiffened, letting myself tremble just enough for her to feel it. "Where is she?" I whispered, keeping my voice thin. "Where is Grandma?" Lydia pulled back, keeping her hands on my shoulders. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning my cheap rental car coat, my messy hair. A look of satisfaction settled over her features. "She is resting. Sweetie, come inside. You look frozen. And honestly, you look terrible. Have you been sleeping at all?" She ushered me into the foyer. The heat of the house hit me instantly. It was stiflingly warm. The great room of the lodge was a mirror image of the house in Boulder, only more rustic. The ceilings were vaulted with exposed beams, and dominating the far wall was a massive fireplace, built from rough-hewn river stone, identical to the one I had nightmares about. A fire was roaring in the grate, the flames leaping 3 feet high. My father was standing by the wet bar, pouring a drink. He looked older than he had in court. His face was flushed, his tie loosened. "You actually came," Richard said, turning to look at me. He didn't smile. He looked annoyed, as if I were a contractor who was late for a meeting. "You said she was here," I said, walking further into the room, hugging my arms around myself. "You said I could see her." Richard sighed, picking up his glass. "We have to talk first. Adeline, we have to discuss this situation." He walked over to the leather sofa and sat down, gesturing for me to take the armchair opposite him. Lydia sat on the arm of the sofa, looking down at him, then at me. "Why are you doing this, Adeline?" Richard asked, swirling his scotch. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? The federal prosecutors? The inquiries? I have investors calling me asking if I'm going to prison." I swallowed hard, looking at the floor. I just wanted to know she was safe. "Dad, you moved her. No one would tell me where she was." "We moved her because you were harassing the staff," Lydia interjected, her voice sharp. "You and that ridiculous doctor. We are protecting her. She is 82 years old. Adeline, she doesn't need federal agents digging through her medicine cabinet." I looked up at Lydia. "Is that why you took my key?" I asked quietly. "Is that why you broke into my apartment?" Lydia laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be dramatic. No one broke into your apartment. You are imagining things, just like you imagined that night 3 years ago." "I am not imagining it," I said, letting my voice rise just a fraction, tinged with hysteria. "You hurt me. Lydia, you hurt me by the fire, and now you are hurting her." Lydia stood up and walked toward me. She stopped 3 feet away. The firelight cast long shadows across her face, making her eyes look like hollow sockets. "You are still so sensitive," she said, shaking her head. "Just like that night. You act like a victim. Adeline, but you are just a girl who couldn't handle the fact that she wasn't special." She took a sip of her wine. "Your grandmother is fine. She is sleeping in the guest suite. But you are not seeing her until you sign a statement." "What statement?" I asked. "A statement retracting your allegations to the U.S. attorney." Richard said, "A statement saying you were confused, that you were off your medication, and that you made a mistake." "And if I don't?" I asked. Richard shrugged. "Then Evelyn stays here. The snow gets deep in the winter. Adeline, sometimes the roads are closed for weeks. It would be a shame if she didn't get her heart medication because the delivery truck couldn't get through." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He was threatening to let his own mother die. He was saying it casually, as if discussing a zoning permit. I hope Ava was hearing this. I hope the microphone taped to my chest was catching every syllable of his indifference. "I need a drink," Lydia announced suddenly. She looked at my empty hands. "Do you want water? You look like you are going to faint." "Yes, please," I whispered. Lydia turned and walked toward the kitchen, her heels clicking on the hardwood. Richard rubbed his temples. "I am going to the study to get the papers," he muttered. "Don't move." He stood up and walked down the hallway to the left. I was alone in the great room. I waited 5 seconds, then 10. I stood up. I didn't run. I walked silently toward the fireplace. The heat was intense. The stones were hot to the touch. I looked at the structure. It was uncanny how similar it was to the one in Boulder. My grandmother had designed both houses. She had hired the same masons. "I know its bones," her letter had said. If the Boulder house had a secret, did this one? I glanced at the hallway, empty. I knelt down on the hearthrug. To the right of the firebox, about waist height, there was a large, irregular river stone. It was gray with veins of quartz running through it. I reached out and touched the mortar line surrounding it. It looked solid, but when I pressed my fingernail against the grout, it didn't feel like cement. It felt like silicone mixed with sand, pliable. I looked over my shoulder, still clear. I pushed on the left side of the stone. It didn't move. I pushed on the right side. Nothing. I remembered the key, the copper key Lydia had stolen. It was a skeleton key. But Grandma's note said, "Use the first key, the flat key, the one she gave me 3 years ago." I pulled my keychain out of my pocket. My hands were shaking. I found the small, flat silver key I had carried for 3 years. I looked at the stone again. There was no keyhole. But then I saw it, in the shadow of the stone above it, tucked deep into the recess of the mortar. There was a tiny slot. It was almost invisible, hidden by the overhang of the rock. I jammed the key into the slot. It slid in with a gritty scrape. I turned it. Click. It wasn't a loud click. It was a soft, mechanical release. The large gray stone popped forward about 1/2 inch. My heart stopped. I hooked my fingers behind the stone and pulled. It swung outward on a hidden hinge. Behind the stone was a dark, hollow cavity. It wasn't empty. I reached inside. My fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a file box, a small, fireproof document box. But before I could pull it out, I heard the click of heels on the floorboards behind me. "Adeline?" Lydia's voice, sharp, suspicious. I slammed the stone shut. It clicked back into place just as I spun around. I was kneeling on the hearth, one hand on the mantel to steady myself, looking like I had just collapsed from exhaustion. Lydia was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand. Her eyes narrowed. She looked at me, then at the fireplace, then back at me. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. I felt dizzy. I stammered, putting a hand to my forehead. I needed to get close to the fire. "I'm so cold. Lydia." Lydia didn't move. She stared at me, her mind working. She was calculating. She knew something was wrong. She walked slowly toward me. setting the water glass down on a side table. "You were always a terrible liar." "Adeline," she said softly. She stopped 2 feet away from me. "Get up," she commanded. I stood up slowly, keeping my back to the fire, shielding the stone I had just opened. Lydia reached out and grabbed the lapel of my coat. "Why are you wearing this coat inside?" she asked. "It is 80 degrees in here." "I am cold," I repeated. She yanked on the coat. "Take it off." "No," I said, grabbing the collar. "Take it off!" she screamed, her face twisting into a mask of rage. She lunged at me. She grabbed the front of my coat and ripped it open. The buttons popped, scattering onto the floor. Underneath, I was wearing the wool sweater, but in the struggle, the collar shifted. And there, gleaming black against my pale skin, was the microphone wire taped to my collarbone. Lydia froze. She stared at the wire, then she looked up at my face. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The shock turned instantly to a feral, terrifying anger. "Richard!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the lodge. "Richard, get the gun!" I didn't wait. I shoved her. I shoved her with every ounce of strength I had gathered over 3 years of silence. Lydia stumbled back, tripping over the hearthrug, and fell hard onto the floor. I turned and ran, not toward the door. Richard was coming from the hallway, and I could hear the heavy racking of a shotgun slide. I ran toward the back of the lodge, toward the guest suite, toward Grandma. I screamed the one word that would bring the world crashing down on them. "Gloves!" I yelled into the microphone. "Ava, gloves! Gloves!" I heard glass shattering behind me. I heard Richard shouting. I sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline flooding my veins, knowing that the only thing between me and a bullet was 2 miles of snowy road and a tactical team that I prayed was faster than my father. The document slid across the polished mahogany coffee table with a sound like a hiss. It was a thick stack of paper, bound with a heavy staple. The title page embossed with the logo of the family's private legal firm. Lydia sat back on the leather sofa, crossing her legs. She picked up her wine glass, the crystal catching the firelight from the massive hearth behind her. "It is a generous offer, Adeline," she said. Her voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a mother explaining simple arithmetic to a slow child. $5 million, placed into a blind trust. You will receive a monthly stipend that will allow you to live very comfortably in Austin. You can buy a house, you can travel, you never have to work another day in your life. I looked at the paper. Family settlement and non-disclosure agreement. "And in exchange?" I asked, keeping my voice small. I kept my hands in my lap, clasping them tightly to hide the tremor that I didn't have to fake. Lydia smiled. "In exchange, you withdraw your complaint to the U.S. Attorney's Office. You sign a statement attributing your previous claims to acute stress and mental fatigue. And of course, you agree to have no further contact with the Caldwell estate or its assets without written permission from the trustees." "Meaning you and Dad," I said. "Meaning the people who know how to manage money." Richard cut in. My father was standing by the mantel, swirling his scotch. He wouldn't look at me. He was looking at the fire, just like he had on that Christmas Eve. He looked tired, his face gray and puffy. "Look, Adeline, we are trying to help you. You are clearly unwell. This crusade of yours, it is embarrassing." I looked from Richard to Lydia. I felt the small plastic device taped to my wrist, hidden under the cuff of my sweater. It was warm against my skin. Ava Morales was sitting in a van 2 miles down the road, listening to every syllable. "What about Grandma?" I asked. "What does she think about this?" Lydia sighed, an exaggerated sound of patience wearing thin. "Evelyn wants peace. Adeline, she is 82. She wants her family to stop fighting." "Does she know you changed the deeds?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Does she know you took her name off the Santa Fe accounts?" Richard snorted. He took a long drink. Those accounts were adjusted long ago. "Adeline, the Santa Fe property was moved into the holding company in 2012. Mother was already forgetting things then. We did it to protect the asset tax exposure." I held my breath. He had just admitted it. He had just admitted to moving assets based on her competency years before any doctor had declared her incompetent. That was fraud. That was the thread Ava needed. I looked at Lydia. And the medical power of attorney? The one you used to pull her out of the care home yesterday? Did she sign that? Or did you guide her hand? Lydia's eyes hardened. The warmth evaporated from her face. You are treading on thin ice, Adeline. I cannot sign this, I said. I pushed the papers back toward her, not without a lawyer, not without seeing Grandma. Lydia stared at the rejected papers. Then she looked at me. A vein in her neck began to throb. We are offering you a lifeline, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are drowning. Adeline, you have no money. You have no job. You are going up against a family that owns half the judges in this state. I am not signing, I repeated. Lydia stood up. The movement was abrupt, violent in its speed. She walked around the coffee table. She didn't look like the socialite anymore. She looked like a predator that had finished playing with its food. She walked to the fireplace. The flames roared behind her, casting her silhouette in sharp relief against the stone. It was a perfect recreation of the nightmare. The heat, the crackle of the wood, the looming figure of the stepmother. You are just like your mother, Lydia spat. Ungrateful, unstable. You think you are a hero? You are a liability. She took a step toward me. I stayed seated, forcing myself to look up at her, forcing my eyes to widen. You said that before, I whispered, on Christmas. You said I wasn't stable enough to lead. Lydia laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. Because you aren't. Look at you, shivering in your cheap coat, making up stories about abuse. You love playing the victim, don't you? It makes you feel special. She reached down and grabbed my arm. It wasn't a gentle tug. Her fingers dug into my bicep, finding the soft flesh, pinching hard enough to bruise. She yanked me upward. Stand up when I'm talking to you, she screamed. I stumbled to my feet, letting her pull me. I was taller than her now. I was stronger than her. But I let my body go limp, let her drag me toward the hearth. Richard did not move. He took another sip of his drink. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, a cheerful sound in a room full of hate. Lydia pulled me close to the fire. The heat was scorching against my legs. She squeezed my arm tighter, her nails digging in through the wool of my sweater. You are going to sign that paper, Lydia hissed, her face inches from mine. Or I swear to God, Adeline, I will have you committed. I will find a doctor who will testify that you are a danger to yourself. I will lock you away in a facility so dark you will forget what the sun looks like. I looked at her. I saw the madness in her eyes, the absolute, terrifying certainty that she owned me. Is that what you did to Grandma? I asked, my voice steady, loud enough for the microphone. Did you squeeze her arm like this? Did you threaten to lock her away? Lydia shook me. Shut up. You are a nothing. You are a guest in this family. I looked over her shoulder at Richard. Dad? I called out. Are you going to watch this? Again? Richard turned his back. He looked at the painting of a stag on the far wall. The silence from him was the final nail. Lydia smiled. See? He doesn't care. No one cares. She squeezed harder. I winced. The pain was real. The flashback was visceral. I was 24 again. I was terrified. But then I remembered the van. I remembered Ava. I remembered the team of federal agents who were listening to a wealthy socialite threaten to imprison her stepdaughter. I looked Lydia in the eye. You don't win. Lydia, I said, not this time. Lydia frowned, confused by the sudden shift in my tone. What? Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the lodge banged open. The sound was like a gunshot. Lydia jumped, her grip on my arm loosening slightly. We both turned. Richard spun around, spilling his scotch. Framed in the doorway was a wheelchair. Grandma Evelyn sat there. She was not wearing a hospital gown. She was dressed in a sharp navy blazer. Her silver hair brushed back. She sat upright, her spine straight, her hands resting on her knees. Behind her stood a woman in scrubs, not one of Lydia's private nurses, but a woman with a stern face and a badge clipped to her pocket, and next to her was a man in a windbreaker that read U.S. Marshal. Lydia dropped my arm. She stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. "How?" Lydia stammered. "Who let you in?" Richard went pale. He put his glass down on the mantel, his hand shaking so badly the crystal rattled against the stone. Grandma Evelyn did not look at Richard. She did not look at me. She looked straight at Lydia. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the fire. Then, Grandma Evelyn began to wheel herself forward. She didn't wait for the nurse. She gripped the rims of her wheels with her gloved hands and pushed. The rubber tires rolled silently over the expensive Persian rugs. She stopped in the center of the room, forming a triangle with Lydia and me. She looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at the bruise forming on my arm where Lydia had just let go. "I told you." "Lydia," Evelyn said. Her voice was not the croak of a dying woman. It was clear. It was icy. It was the voice of the matriarch who had built this empire while Lydia was still learning to mix cocktails. "I told you that you were a poor investment." "Mother." Richard started, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "This is all a misunderstanding. Adeline was just—" "Be quiet, Richard," Evelyn snapped without looking at him. "You lost the right to speak to me when you let that woman forge my signature on your loan documents." Lydia's face went from pale to a blotchy red. She pointed a shaking finger at the marshal. "Get out! This is private property. You have no warrant." The marshal stepped forward. "Actually, Mrs. Caldwell, we have probable cause. We have been listening to the last 10 minutes of conversation, and I believe I just heard you threaten to commit Ms. Duke against her will in exchange for silence regarding federal fraud." Lydia froze. Her eyes darted to me. She looked at my wrist. She saw the slight bulge under my sweater cuff. "You," she whispered, "you little bitch." She lunged for me again. "Adeline!" the marshal shouted, reaching for his belt. But he didn't need to intervene. Grandma Evelyn moved. She spun her wheelchair with surprising speed, blocking Lydia's path. "Sit down." "Lydia!" Grandma barked. It was a command, not a request. It carried 80 years of authority. Lydia stopped, stunned. Grandma Evelyn turned her chair slowly to face the fireplace. She looked at the roaring flames. She looked at the stone hearth where I had been standing, where I had been hurt, where the secret was hidden. She took a deep breath. She lifted her hands from her lap. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the fingertips of her left glove. Richard made a small, strangled noise in his throat. She pulled the glove off, finger by finger. She dropped it on the floor. Then she removed the right one. She laid her bare hands on her knees. They were old hands, spotted with age, but they were steady, and on her wrists, distinct and pale against the aged skin, were circular scars, old scars, the marks of restraints, the marks of a woman who had been tied down to a bed in a private facility so she wouldn't make phone calls. She looked up at me. Her eyes were shining with tears, but her jaw was set in stone. They thought silence was compliance. She said to me, they thought my hands were too weak to fight. She turned to the marshal. "Officer," she said, "I would like to make a statement, and then I would like my granddaughter to open the wall behind that fireplace." Lydia let out a scream, a primal, terrified sound, and bolted for the hallway. "Secure her!" the marshal yelled into his radio. The room erupted into chaos, but I didn't move. I stood by the fire, looking at my grandmother, and for the first time in 3 years, the cold inside me finally began to thaw. The silence in the lodge was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a submarine before the hull breaches. The only sound was the fire. The logs in the massive stone hearth hissed and popped, sending showers of sparks up the chimney. But even the fire seemed afraid to make too much noise in the presence of the woman in the wheelchair. Grandma Evelyn sat in the center of the room. The U.S. Marshal stood behind her, his hand resting near his holster, but his eyes were fixed on her hands. The nurse from the prosecutor's office had stepped back, giving the matriarch the stage. Lydia was breathing hard, her chest heaving beneath her cashmere sweater, backed against the heavy oak table. Richard was frozen near the wet bar, a statue of a man who had realized too late that he was standing on a trapdoor. We all watched the gloves. Those cream-colored leather gloves had been part of Grandma Evelyn's silhouette for as long as I could remember. She wore them at Easter brunch. She wore them to the opera. She wore them on that terrible Christmas Eve 3 years ago. We had always assumed they were an affectation of her class, a vanity of an old woman protecting her skin from the mountain sun. Evelyn lifted her left hand. With agonizing slowness, she used her right hand to grip the tip of the middle finger of the left glove. She pulled. Shh! The soft sound of leather sliding against skin was amplified in the quiet room. It sounded like a blade being drawn from a sheath. She did not rush. She tugged the index finger, then the thumb. She worked the leather down over her palm, over the heel of her hand, and finally over her wrist. She let the glove fall. It hit the floor with a soft, defeated slap. Then, she switched hands. She repeated the process for the right hand. The tension in the room ratcheted up with every inch of skin revealed. Lydia was staring at those hands as if they were holding a grenade. When the second glove fell, Grandma Evelyn did not speak immediately. She placed her hands flat on her thighs, palms down. I gasped. The sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Her hands were not just old, they were a map of torture. The skin on her knuckles was discolored, mottled with bruises in various stages of healing, some yellow, some angry purple, but it was her wrists that made the marshal take a sharp intake of breath. Encircling both wrists were thin, white, circular scars. They were distinct. They were uniform. They were the marks of zip ties or leather restraints. They were the marks of someone who had been tied to a bed or a chair, day after day, fighting against bonds that cut into the paper-thin skin of an 80-year-old woman. "Lydia," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What did you do to her?" Lydia didn't answer. She was staring at the floor, her face pale. Grandma Evelyn slowly rotated her wrists. She held them up, turning them in the firelight so that everyone could see. She turned them toward Richard. She turned them toward the marshal, and then she looked directly at the ceiling, toward the hidden corner of the room, as if presenting evidence to God himself. Or to a camera. "These," Grandma said, her voice dry and rasping but steady as a rock, "correspond to the dates when my signature became required for the Summit Ridge refinancing. January of 2019, March of 2020. She looked at Richard. "You told the board I was in Europe," Evelyn said. "You told me I was confused, and when I refused to sign the power of attorney, Lydia tied me to the bed frame in the guest house. She said it was for my own safety. She said I was a danger to myself because I kept trying to use the phone." "That is a lie," Lydia screamed, her voice cracking. "She is senile. She did that to herself, scratching at her eczema." Evelyn ignored her. She turned her hands over, palms facing up. "Look closer," she commanded the nurse. The nurse from the prosecutor's office stepped forward. She knelt beside the wheelchair. On the soft, wrinkled palm of Grandma's right hand, right in the center of the lifeline, was a small square of transparent medical tape, and trapped beneath the tape was a tiny black speck. A micro SD card. "I kept it close," Grandma whispered. "I knew if I put it in my pocket, they would find it when they bathed me. I knew if I put it in the room, they would find it when they tossed it for contraband. So I kept it here, in my hand, under the glove." She peeled the tape off with a wince. She handed the tiny chip to the nurse. "Play it," Evelyn said. The nurse stood up and walked to the coffee table where she had set down a ruggedized laptop. She inserted the card into a reader. She turned the laptop around so the screen faced the room. She keyed a few commands, and a video player opened. The timestamp on the video file read, December 24th, 2018. My heart hammered against my ribs. The video began. The angle was high. Looking down from the crown molding in the corner of the great room in Boulder, The picture was grainy, black and white, but the audio was crystal clear. I saw the top of my own head. I saw the back of Richard's suit. I saw Lydia's emerald velvet dress. I watched the past unfold in terrifying silence. I saw myself standing by the table. I heard my own voice, younger and more desperate, asking for a seat on the board. It isn't imagination. Lydia, it is my money. I saw Lydia stand up. I saw the way she stalked around the table like a panther. I saw her grab my wrist. On the screen, the violence was stark. Without the fog of memory, it looked even worse. It looked criminal. Lydia yanked me toward the fireplace. She twisted my arm. I saw myself stumble. You are nothing. You are a guest in this house. Then, the camera caught what I had missed in the moment. It caught Richard. In the video, my father didn't just look away. He took a sip of his wine, checked his watch, and then deliberately turned his chair 10 degrees to the left so he wouldn't have to see his wife assaulting his daughter. It was an act of such casual cowardice that I felt bile rise in my throat. And then, the camera caught Evelyn. I watched my grandmother on the screen. She was sitting in the wheelchair. As Lydia screamed at me, Evelyn's hand moved to the side of her chair. She didn't look frail. She looked focused. She pulled something from the cushion. The key. I watched her stand up. I watched the painful, slow shuffle across the rug. I saw her distract Lydia. I saw the transfer. The video ended. The screen went black. The lodge was silent. Lydia was shaking. She was hugging herself, her fingernails digging into her arms. Grandma Evelyn spoke into the silence. I installed those cameras in 2015, she said. After I found bruises on Martin Hale's daughter, I knew you were dangerous. Lydia, but I didn't know how far Richard would let you go. She looked at her son. I waited, she said softly. I waited for 3 years. I have gigabytes of footage. I have footage of you practicing my signature. Lydia, I have footage of Richard discussing how to launder the charity money through the construction firm. I have audio of you laughing about how easy it was to gaslight Adeline. Why didn't you stop us? Richard whispered. His face was gray. Why did you let us do it? Because I was alone, Evelyn said. She looked at me then, her eyes softening. I was an old woman in a wheelchair. If I had gone to the police then, you would have buried me with lawyers. You would have claimed I was incompetent. I needed a witness. I needed a soldier. She reached out a trembling hand toward me. I waited for Adeline to be ready. She said, I watched you that night by the fireplace. Adeline, I saw you take the abuse and not break. I saw the fire in you. And I knew that if I gave you the key, if I gave you enough time to find your own strength, you would be the one to bring the house down. She turned back to Lydia. But you made a mistake, Lydia. You got greedy. You thought you could rewrite the past. Evelyn pointed a crooked finger at the fireplace in the lodge. You want to know what is in the wall? She asked. You want to know what is in the box in Boulder? Lydia didn't answer. She was backing away toward the kitchen. It isn't money, Evelyn said. The money is gone. Lydia froze. What? I transferred my majority shares in Caldwell Holdings to an irrevocable trust in 2010. Evelyn said, the day after Martin Hale warned me about you, the trust is in Adeline's name. It has been accumulating interest for 10 years. She smiled, a thin, sharp expression. Every document you forced me to sign, every transfer you faked, every asset you thought you stole, it was all void from the start. You have been stealing from a hollow shell. You have been fighting for a kingdom that already belongs to her. She pointed at me. The original trust documents, with the wet ink signatures and the biometric notary stamps, are in the fireproof box in the stone wall in Boulder. And the only person who can open it is the girl you just tried to bribe with $5 million of her own money. Lydia let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. You old witch! Lydia shrieked. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the side table. Lydia! Richard shouted. But before she could throw it, the front door of the lodge burst open. It wasn't just the wind this time. Ava Morales walked in, flanked by 4 armed federal agents. She was wearing a Kevlar vest over her blazer. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Drop the glass, Mrs. Caldwell," Ava said, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Lydia stood there, chest heaving, the decanter raised. "Drop it, or we will authorize force," an agent yelled, raising his rifle. Lydia's hand trembled. The decanter slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, spraying amber liquid and glass shards across the Persian rug. Ava walked forward. She didn't look at Lydia. She walked straight to Grandma Evelyn. "Mrs. Caldwell," Ava said respectfully, "I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Morales. We heard everything, and we have seen the video." She turned to the agents. "Execute the warrant," she commanded. Ava turned to me. Her eyes were bright, fierce. "Adeline," she said, "we have a judge on standby in Denver. Based on the video evidence of the assault and the audio of the extortion we just recorded, we have probable cause to open the wall in Boulder." She handed me an evidence bag. "But first," she said, "I believe you have a wall to open here." I looked at the fireplace. I looked at the loose stone I had found earlier. I walked over to it. I pulled the flat silver key from my pocket, the one I had kept for 3 years, the one Lydia hadn't found because she was looking for a copper skeleton key. I inserted it into the hidden slot in the mortar. Click. The stone swung open. I reached into the dark cavity. My hand closed around a metal box. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I set it on the coffee table. "Open it," Grandma whispered. I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't gold. It was a stack of leather-bound journals, and on top of them, a thick file labeled The Caldwell Confessions, Martin Hale copy. I looked at Richard. He had sunk onto the sofa, his head in his hands. I looked at Lydia. An agent was clicking handcuffs onto her wrists, steel cuffs that looked so much colder than the leather gloves she had forced my grandmother to wear. I picked up the file. I held it up. "It is over," I said. Grandma Evelyn nodded. She reached out and took my hand, her bare, scarred hand in mine. "No," she said softly, looking at the fire. "The fire is just starting, Adeline. But this time, we are the ones holding the match." The morning sun did not rise over the Boulder estate so much as it pierced through the gray winter overcast like a spotlight. I stood outside the wrought iron gates, my breath pluming in the frigid air. This time, I was not the shivering girl begging to be let in. I was standing next to a federal tactical vehicle, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint the snow in violent, alternating strokes. The raid had begun at 6 in the morning. It was a spectacle of justice that felt almost surgical. A convoy of black SUVs and marked police cruisers had swarmed the driveway. I watched as agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI and IRS poured out of the vehicles. They did not ring the doorbell. They breached the front door with a battering ram. Though I knew the house was empty, Richard and Lydia were currently sitting in holding cells in downtown Denver, awaiting their arraignment. Ava Morales stepped out of the lead vehicle. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, but there was a kinetic energy to her movements. She waved me over. "Are you ready to go back inside, Adeline?" she asked. I looked at the house. It looked different now, without Lydia's manicured presence, without Richard's looming shadow. It was just a pile of wood and stone. It was a crime scene. "I am ready," I said. We walked up the driveway. The snow was trampled by heavy boots. Inside, the house was a hive of activity. Photographers were documenting every room. Agents were tagging furniture. A team was already boxing up the contents of Richard's study. But Ava led me straight to the living room. The great room was exactly as I remembered it, yet entirely alien. The Christmas tree was gone, the furniture had been pushed to the sides, and standing before the massive Riverstone fireplace, the altar of my trauma, was a team of forensic specialists. They had set up floodlights that washed the stone in a harsh, clinical white glare. "We recovered this from Lydia's handbag at the lodge," Ava said. She handed me an evidence bag. Inside sat the heavy copper skeleton key, the one Lydia had stolen from my apartment in Austin, the one Grandma Evelyn had sent me in the box. I put on a pair of latex gloves and took the key. It felt cold and heavy, a dead weight in my palm. I walked to the hearth. I knew exactly where to look now. The design at the lodge had been a replica, a practice run for this very moment. I knelt on the rug, the same spot where Lydia had twisted my wrist, the same spot where I had cried while my father drank his wine. I located the large gray river stone to the right of the firebox. I ran my gloved finger along the mortar line until I found the hidden slot, concealed by the overhang of the rock above it. I inserted the copper key. It turned with a heavy, grinding sound, much stiffer than the one at the lodge. This mechanism hadn't been oiled in years. I had to use 2 hands, putting my shoulder into it, twisting until the metal bit into the lock. Clunk. The sound echoed in the silent room. The agents behind me stopped talking. The photographers lowered their cameras. The stone popped forward. I pulled it open. Behind the stone face was a steel safe door, embedded deep into the masonry of the chimney. It was old. A dial combination lock. I froze. I didn't have a combination. Grandma hadn't sent a code. Ava stepped forward. Did she give you numbers? Any dates? I shook my head, panic rising. No, she just sent the key. Think. Adeline, Ava urged. She planned this for 10 years. She wouldn't leave you at the finish line without a way to cross it. I looked at the dial. It was a standard 4-number tumble. I closed my eyes. I thought about the music box she had sent me. I thought about the letter. I know it's Bones. She had written. I thought about the date everything changed. The date Martin Hale disappeared. The date she realized she was alone. November 14th, 2010. I reached out and spun the dial. 1, 1, 1, 4, 2, 0, 1, 0. The handle turned. The steel door swung open on silent hinges. The cavity inside was dry and cool, insulated from the heat of the fire. It was stacked floor to ceiling with documents. I reached in and pulled out the first item. It was a thick envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. On the front, in Grandma Evelyn's distinct, looping script, was written, "Last Will and Testament," the real one. I opened it. My hands shook as I unfolded the document. It was dated January 5th, 2011. I read the preamble. It revoked all previous wills. It established a primary trust containing the controlling interest of Caldwell Properties, the deeds to the Boulder Estate, the Santa Fe Lodge, and the portfolio of commercial buildings in Denver. Beneficiary, Adeline Marie Duke. Trustee, Martin Hale. I looked at Ava. She never signed it over to them, I whispered. She did this right after Martin warned her, for the last 10 years. Richard has been acting as CEO of a company he didn't own. Every document he signed, every loan he took out against the equity, it was all fraud. Ava nodded grimly. That makes every bank transfer wire fraud. It makes every salary withdrawal embezzlement. This single piece of paper destroys their entire defense. I reached back into the safe. There was a second envelope. This one plain and white, sealed with Scotch tape that had yellowed with age. On the front was a name, Martin Hale. I opened it carefully. Inside was a 3-page letter, handwritten on legal pad paper. The ink was blue, the pressure of the pen uneven, as if the writer had been terrified. Dear Adeline, if you are reading this, I am sorry. I am sorry I wasn't brave enough to stay. On the night of November 14th, your father and Lydia called me to the house. They knew about the new trust. Lydia had a bottle of wine open. Richard had a fireplace poker. They didn't hit me. They didn't have to. Lydia showed me photos of my daughter, Sarah, waiting at her bus stop. She had photos of Sarah at soccer practice. She said that accidents happen on icy roads. I felt a chill run through me. I remembered Martin Hale as a kind, soft-spoken man. To think of him standing in this room, threatened with the death of his child, made my blood turn to ice. They forced me to draft a durable power of attorney giving Lydia control over Evelyn. I did it, but I also made a copy of the original trust. I gave one to Evelyn to hide, and I am sending this one into the void, hoping it finds its way back to the truth. I also created a digital backup on a USB drive and gave it to Hazel. I told her to wait until the Caldwells fell. I hope she did. Do not let them win. Adeline, they are hollow. They are rot painted over with gold leaf. Martin. I handed the letter to Ava. She scanned it, her face hardening into a mask of prosecutorial fury. This is a death sentence for them, Ava said quietly. This connects the financial crime to the extortion. This makes it a RICO case. We are going to bury them under the jail. There was one more thing in the safe. It was a small black leather notebook, a pocket diary. I opened it. It wasn't a diary of thoughts. It was a ledger of crimes. Grandma Evelyn had been keeping score. Every page was dated. August 4th, 2012. Lydia forged my signature on the transfer of the Canyon View deed. I saw her practicing at the kitchen table. December 12th, 2014. Richard withdrew $50,000 from my personal account. He told me it was for roof repairs. The roof was never fixed. July 9th, 2016. Lydia switched my heart medication. I felt dizzy for 3 days. She told the doctor I was refusing to eat. It went on for pages, hundreds of entries, dates, times, check numbers, bank routing numbers. She had recorded every single time they stole from her, every time they gaslighted her, every time they abused her. She had sat in her wheelchair, wearing her gloves to hide the bruises, and she had written it all down while they slept. This, I said, tapping the book, this is the map. This tells you exactly where to look for the money. Ava took the book. She held it like it was a holy relic. We need to get this to the forensic accountants, she said. Adeline, you did it. You found the smoking gun. I walked out of the house an hour later. The sun was fully up now, reflecting off the snow with a blinding intensity. Outside the gates, the world had arrived. News vans were parked along the road for half a mile. Reporters were shouting questions over the fence. Adeline, is it true your grandmother was a spy? Adeline, did your father threaten a lawyer? Ms. Duke, how much money did they steal? I ignored them. I got into Ava's car. I pulled out my phone and opened the news app. The headline on the national feed was not about the greedy granddaughter anymore. The spy in the wheelchair. How 80-year-old Evelyn Caldwell took down a real estate empire from the inside. The article described the raid. It described the arrest at the lodge. It described Grandma Evelyn's dramatic removal of her gloves. The public sentiment had flipped overnight. The comments section was flooded with support. Give that lady a medal. Lydia Caldwell is a monster. I hope Adeline takes them for everything they have. It was vindication, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. Can we go see her? I asked Ava. Ava nodded. She is at Denver Memorial, in the VIP secure wing. We have guards at the door. Lydia isn't getting anywhere near her. The hospital room was quiet and smelled of lilies. Grandma Evelyn was sitting up in bed, looking frail but alert. She wasn't wearing gloves. Her hands, with their scars and bruises, rested openly on the white blanket. When I walked in, she smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had seen on her face in 10 years. Did you find it? She asked. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. I found everything. Grandma, the will, the letter, the notebook. She let out a long sigh, sinking back into the pillows. Good. Then I can finally sleep. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice catching. Why did you let me think you were losing your mind? Why did you let me leave for Austin? She squeezed my hand. Her grip was weaker now, but the steel was still there. Because you weren't ready. Adeline, she said softly, if I had told you when you were 24, you would have tried to fight them with anger. You would have screamed, and they would have crushed you. They would have called you hysterical and cut you off. She looked out the window at the mountains. I needed you to go away. I needed you to build your own life. I needed you to become someone who didn't need their money. Because a woman who doesn't need money is the only thing a man like Richard fears. She looked back at me, and I had to play my part. If I had shown even an ounce of strength, Lydia would have killed me. She would have overdosed me or pushed me down the stairs. My weakness was my armor. Adeline, by letting them think I was a senile old fool, I became invisible to them. They stopped hiding things from me because they thought I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Tears streamed down my face. You went through hell. For me. No, she said firmly. For us. For the family name. And for justice. She reached up and wiped a tear from my cheek with her scarred thumb. Now, dry your eyes. We have a trial to prepare for, and I do not want you crying in front of them. You are a Caldwell, and Caldwells do not cry when they are winning. The next 3 months were a blur of depositions, subpoenas, and legal strategy. Ava Morales built a case that was a fortress, with the evidence from the wall, the testimony from the raid, and the recovered files from Martin Hale. The indictment against Richard and Lydia Caldwell ran to 400 pages. Charges of racketeering, wire fraud, elder abuse, kidnapping, witness intimidation, forgery. They were denied bail. The judge, seeing the video of Lydia attacking me and the scars on Evelyn's wrists, declared them a flight risk and a danger to the community. The empire crumbled instantly. The banks called in the loans. The investors sued. The Summit Ridge project was seized by the federal government. The name Caldwell, once a symbol of mountain luxury, became shorthand for greed. And then, the day came. The day of the trial. I stood in front of the mirror in the witness waiting room. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal coat. I thought about the girl who had stood by the fireplace. I thought about the girl who had driven to Austin with a broken heart. I picked up my bag. Inside was the silver music box, polished to a shine. I walked out into the hallway. The click of my heels on the marble floor sounded like a drumbeat. Ava was waiting for me at the door to the courtroom. "Ready?" she asked. I looked at the double doors. Beyond them sat my father. Beyond them sat Lydia. Beyond them sat the world, waiting to hear the story of the fireplace. I put my hand on the brass handle. I didn't need gloves. My hands were steady. "I am ready," I said. I pushed the doors open and walked into the blinding light of the courtroom, ready to finish the story that Grandma Evelyn had started writing in the dark. The trial of the United States versus Richard and Lydia Caldwell did not begin with a bang. It began with the slow, suffocating scratch of a defense attorney's pen against a yellow legal pad. For the first 3 days, the defense team tried to dismantle me. Their strategy was predictable, brutal, and entirely focused on character assassination. Their lead counsel, a man named Mr. Sterling, who wore suits that cost more than my annual salary, painted a portrait of Adeline Duke that was unrecognizable to me. He called me the prodigal daughter. He called me unstable. He called me a failed career woman who had returned to the family trough only when her own funds ran dry. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sterling said, pacing in front of the box, "we have a daughter who has a history of financial erraticism. We have a young woman who gave nearly $500,000 to a company without a contract, and then claimed it was a loan when she regretted her generosity. Is this the behavior of a rational investor? Or is it the behavior of a woman desperate for attention? A woman who is now weaponizing her grandmother's dementia to exact revenge on the stepmother she has always envied?" I sat at the prosecution table, my hands folded in my lap. I did not flinch. 3 years ago, those words would have made me cry. They would have made me question my own sanity. But today, I just watched Richard. He was staring at the table. He looked diminished. The arrogance of the Mountain King was gone, replaced by the jittery exhaustion of a man who knows the walls are closing in. Lydia sat beside him, rigid and icy. She was still trying to play the part of the aggrieved matriarch, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue whenever the defense mentioned the difficult burden of caring for an aging relative. When it was Ava Morales' turn, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Ava did not use flowery language. She did not pace. She stood at the podium, anchored by the weight of the truth, and she began to build the cage. The defense wants to talk about character, Ava said, her voice clear and resonant. So let us talk about character. Let us talk about the character of a son who steals from his mother. Let us talk about the character of a woman who ties an 80-year-old lady to a bed frame. She dimmed the lights. The video from the Boulder fireplace flickered onto the massive screens mounted on the walls. The courtroom went deadly silent. I watched the jurors. I saw a young woman in the back row cover her mouth with her hand. I saw the foreman, a stern-looking man in a flannel shirt, narrow his eyes as he watched Lydia Caldwell twist my arm. He watched Richard turn his chair away. He watched the casual, domestic violence of the Caldwell home played out in black and white. Then, Ava played the audio. Martin Hale's voice, trembling with terror, filled the room. He spoke of threats. He spoke of his daughter. He spoke of the poker in Richard's hand. Then came the notebook. Ava projected the pages of Grandma Evelyn's diary. The handwriting was shaky, but the dates were precise. October 4th, 2012. Richard withdrew $12,000. He said it was for taxes. The taxes were paid in April. March 1st, 2015. Lydia forced me to sign the deed transfer. She held my wrist until I cried. Ava walked over to the exhibit table. She picked up the original will, the one I had pulled from the stone wall. This, Ava said, holding the document up like a sword, is the only legal document that matters. It proves that for 10 years, Richard and Lydia Caldwell have been operating a criminal enterprise using assets they did not own. Every check they wrote was fraud. Every loan they secured was theft. They were not caretakers. They were parasites. The weight of the evidence was crushing. You could feel it in the air. The defense table seemed to physically sink under the pressure. Richard was the first to break. It happened during the cross-examination. Ava was pressing him on the shell companies, on the transfers to Blue Spruce Consulting. Mr. Caldwell? Ava asked. Did you knowingly authorize the transfer of $400,000 from your mother's charitable trust to your personal construction account on June 3rd, 2016? Richard wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked at the jury. He looked at the judge. Then, he looked at Lydia. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Richard stammered. His voice was weak. Answer the question, Ava pressed. I didn't want to do it, Richard blurted out. He pointed a shaking finger at Lydia. It was her idea. She told me the trust was just sitting there. She said Mother wouldn't notice. She handled the paperwork. I just signed what she put in front of me. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Lydia turned on him, her eyes wide with shock. You coward, she hissed. You spineless coward. You needed that money for your gambling debts. Order! The judge banged his gavel. But the dam had broken. The united front of the Caldwells had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Richard continued, desperate to save himself. She controlled everything. She forged the medical power of attorney. She was the one who moved Mother to the lodge. She told me that if we isolated her, she would die faster, and the probate would be easier. Lydia stood up. She slammed her hands on the table. Shut up, Lydia screamed. Her facade of elegance evaporated. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She turned toward me, pointing a finger that looked like a talon. This is your fault, Lydia shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. You ungrateful little brat. You were always jealous. You wanted her money. You wanted her attention. You are a parasite. Adeline, you are nothing without the Caldwell name. She was unraveling. She was proving every single thing Grandma Evelyn had written in her notebook. She was showing the jury exactly who she was, a woman who needed to control, to dominate, to destroy anything that threatened her power. Marshals, restrain the defendant, the judge ordered. Lydia was forced back into her seat, breathing heavily, her eyes wild. The judge looked down at the prosecution table. Ms. Morales, call your next witness. Ava stood up. The prosecution calls Evelyn Caldwell. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The bailiff pushed the wheelchair down the center aisle. Grandma Evelyn sat upright. She was wearing a simple navy dress. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed. But she was not wearing gloves. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. She was wheeled to the witness stand. The bailiff helped her lock the brakes. She placed her hands on the wooden ledge of the stand. The courtroom sketch artist leaned forward. The jurors leaned forward. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom, the scars were impossible to miss. The white, circular bands of scar tissue around her wrists stood out against her age-spotted skin. The bruises on her knuckles, fading but still visible, told a story that no lawyer could argue away. "Mrs. Caldwell," Ava asked gently, "can you tell the court why you are not wearing your gloves today?" Grandma Evelyn looked at Lydia. She looked at Richard. Then she looked at the jury. "For 3 years, I wore gloves to hide my shame," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to the back of the room. "I was ashamed that I had raised a son who would let a woman hurt me. I was ashamed that I was too weak to stop it." She lifted her hands. "But I realized something," she continued. "I let them think I was weak. I let them think I was confused. I let them bind my wrists because I needed to see how far they would go. I needed to see if there was any humanity left in them." She paused, letting her hands drop back to the wood. "There wasn't. They mistook my silence for surrender. But the gloves are off now." She looked directly at me. "And I want to make one thing clear to this court," she said. "The defense claims my granddaughter, Adeline, is motivated by greed. They claim she wants my fortune." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a notarized directive I signed this morning." Grandma Evelyn announced, "Upon the conclusion of this trial, the entirety of the Caldwell estate, the land, the holdings, the investments, will be liquidated. Every single penny will go to establish the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial protection for the elderly against familial abuse." She looked at Richard, who had gone pale as a sheet. "There is no inheritance. Richard, there is no empire left to steal." Then she looked at me. "I have appointed only one trustee to manage this foundation," she said, "Adeline Duke. She will not receive a dime of the fortune for herself. She will receive a salary for her work. She will not be the queen of a real estate empire. She will be the shield for people like me." Tears pricked my eyes. It was the ultimate twist. It was the ultimate revenge. She wasn't just stripping them of the money, she was stripping them of the motive. She was proving to the world that the only person in that family who didn't care about the gold was the one who had been accused of hunting for it. "Real power," Grandma said, turning back to the judge, "isn't holding on to what you have. It is choosing who you let go of. And today, I am choosing to let go of my son." The silence that followed lasted for 10 seconds. It was the silence of a truth so absolute that it left no room for argument. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman did not look at the defense table. "We find the defendant, Richard Caldwell, guilty on all counts. We find the defendant, Lydia Caldwell, guilty on all counts." The charges rolled out like a drumbeat: racketeering, wire fraud, kidnapping, elder abuse. Lydia put her head on the table and sobbed. It wasn't a sad sound. It was the angry, frustrated sound of a child who has been told no for the first time. Richard just stared at the wall, hollowed out, a man who had sold his soul and received nothing in return. The judge set the sentencing hearing for next month, but he made it clear. They were looking at 20 years. They would die in prison. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, Richard looked back at me. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask for forgiveness, perhaps to blame me one last time. But I didn't look at him. I was looking at my grandmother. Later, in the hallway outside the courtroom, the chaos of the press was muffled by the heavy doors. I sat on a wooden bench next to Grandma Evelyn's wheelchair. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, heavy exhaustion. She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was warm. The scars on her wrist rubbed against my palm. "We did it," I whispered. She squeezed my fingers. You did it. Adeline, you came back. I looked at her hands. I thought you were helpless that night, I said, my voice trembling. By the fire. When she hurt me, I thought you couldn't do anything. Grandma Evelyn shook her head slowly. I was never helpless, she said, but I was alone. I needed a partner, and that night, when I saw you take the pain and keep standing, I knew I had found one. She smiled, a genuine, tired smile. You thought I was the only one on your side, she said, but Adeline, you were the only one worth fighting for. I leaned my head on her shoulder. We sat there for a long time, two survivors in the quiet aftermath of a war. When I finally walked out of the courthouse, the sun was setting over Denver. The sky was a brilliant, burning orange. The reporters surged forward, microphones thrust in my face, questions shouting over one another. Adeline, how does it feel? Adeline, what will you do with the foundation? I didn't answer. I put on my sunglasses. I walked down the steps, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing on the concrete. Click, click, click. In my head, I heard the crackle of the fireplace in Boulder. I heard the pop of the birch logs. I heard the sound of Lydia's voice and the silence of my father. But then, the sound changed. It became the sharp, final crack of the judge's gavel. Bang. I took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. That night, years ago, I cried while my stepmother beat me near the fireplace. Today, the entire justice system had to look straight into the flames that she and my father had tried to hide. And they burned. They burned until there was nothing left but the truth. I got into my car and drove away, leaving the ashes behind me. The story was over. The work was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below with your location so we can connect. If you enjoyed Adeline's journey, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that like button to help this story be heard by even more people.